Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum, and the type of content we'll be looking at in this video is a bit different from what I usually address. I usually address content from major political sources, but I figured I'll change up the status quo a little bit. Today we're looking at the children's television show Arthur. Anyone who grew up in the 90s and 2000s will probably be familiar with this iconic PBS cartoon. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, what's a political commentator like me doing addressing a children's television show? Well, Arthur has gone pretty woke lately. Now, of course, Arthur has addressed political issues in the past. This isn't anything particularly new for this series, mind you. But they've become particularly blatant, in-your-face, propaganda-ish about it lately, and this doesn't appear to be unique to Arthur specifically. It seems like PBS in general is becoming a mouthpiece for left-wing propaganda. Sesame Street in particular has been notorious for this. As a matter of fact, I'll probably address some Sesame Street propaganda as well in another video. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that PBS would be a left-wing mouthpiece. They get a fuck ton of backing and funding from the government. As we've seen from the public education system, anything funded or backed by the government is basically going to be a mouthpiece for propaganda. Yet I digress. So in the clips you're about to see, Arthur is going to take on two of the major issues that the left is all about right now, which are masks and racism. Let's get into it.
So, what have you been up to lately?
Playing games with my family, mostly. We have this one game where I kick a soccer ball off the balcony, and my dad tries to catch it in a wheelbarrow.
Wow, that sounds so...
Fun! I know!
I wish this virus thing was over. I am getting so bored.
Yeah, I wouldn't get your hopes up. This shit's probably gonna last forever. I mean, they keep telling us that this new normal we're forced to live is temporary and not permanent. But have you guys noticed how the goalpost for the end of this pandemic is like constantly moving? First it was 15 days to flatten the curve. Then it was until we have a vaccine. Well, now not only do we have multiple vaccines, but they're all over 90% effective, the liberals are concocting some sort of narrative where the virus is mutating and forming new strands which could be resistant to the vaccine, or some other reason like that where, yeah, even if you do get the vax, the government still has an excuse to take greater control over your life or whatever. I mean, we're told that this pandemic is temporary, that this new normal is just long enough as to not overwhelm the healthcare system, but the liberal agenda appears to be to drag it out indefinitely.
Hello, Francine. Muffy, ready for our trip to Crosswire Motors where prices can't be beat?
Yeah, because, you know, nothing like a period of mass unemployment and economic devastation for an auto dealership to have a big sales event. Sales of durable goods such as automobiles are actually hit the hardest in economic downturns. This is due to a variety of reasons, but the main reason is if people are experiencing income instability, they're much less likely to take on a risky loan.
Be right there, Daddy. I have to go. Today is a humongous sales event.
That's right. And my Muffykins is the best sales event decorator in Elwood City. Oh, that reminds me. Now, where did I leave those special...
Okay, just need to grab my purse and I'm ready.
Do you have your mask? You're gonna wear a mask, right?
Look at Francine here being the mask police.
That's the sound of the police. That's the sound of the beast.
Only sick people need masks, Francine, and I am not sick.
What?
Although I did stub my toe in the pool, I have this little bruise which you can
Earth to
totally
Muffy.
see when I wear sandals.
Earth to Muffy.
I love Francine's reaction to the fact that Muffy doesn't want to wear a mask. She's just completely shocked and bewildered and outraged. Like, how could you possibly not want to wear a mask? What I think is funny is that the characters in this show are supposed to be like 5 to 8, that sort of age range. And she's like in genuine shock and outrage over her not wanting to wear a mask. You know, I bet that most 5 to 8-year-olds don't give two fucks about wearing a mask. They only wear them because adults are making them. They're probably all in the back of their head thinking, this is fucking stupid, I don't want to take this goddamn thing off.
If you're going out in public, you 100% need a mask.
So one of the most frustrating things I find about all the mask rhetoric being pushed around is that it's always in binaries. Anytime you're going out in public, you 100% absolutely without any sort of doubt whatsoever need a mask. End of conversation. Now, because I've been critical of government mandatory mask mandates, there's been a tendency for people to label me as an anti-masker. And well, if you've actually watched my videos on masks and taken the time to understand my arguments, you'll know that my opinion on masks is is a bit more nuanced than that. Although I am critical of the government forcing people to wear masks against their will if they don't want to, I do think there are advantages to wearing masks in general. I've mentioned in previous videos how in Asian cultures, like in China and Japan, it's considered normal for people to wear a mask out in public when they're sick. Not just as a courtesy to others to prevent them from getting sick as well, but also as kind of a warning signal that says, hey, I'm sick, you should keep your distance from me. Of course, another thing I've mentioned as well is that one of the disadvantages to forcing everybody to wear masks is that they lose their effectiveness as that warning signal. Put simply, if all the sick and healthy people look alike, I don't know who to avoid and who I can be comfortable around. This is a certain nuance to the issue that you don't see when you're simply thinking in terms of pro-mask and anti-mask.
But why? I'm not sick, and I don't like how they look.
First of all, you can be sick and not know it. You can have the virus and feel totally fine.
I love how COVID is simultaneously so deadly that we need blanket across-the-board mask mandates for everybody, and so benign that most people who have it don't show any symptoms. I also love how excited Francine is getting over all this. Like, just look at her. Arms extended, big-ass grin on her face. Like, she is pumped for this shit.
Second, without a mask, you could spread it to someone who will get really sick. Like Buster, who has asthma, or Mrs. McGrady, who had cancer, or your grandparents, or someone you don't even know.
Yep, she said it. There it is, the classic good old-fashioned fear-mongering over grandma. Just as whenever you criticize taxation, it's only a matter of time until someone says roads, whenever you criticize the COVID hysteria, it's only a matter of time until someone says grandma.
But shouldn't they wear the masks?
Of course, but it doesn't help if you're sick and you don't wear one. The only way to keep everyone safe is to wear a mask.
So here's another aspect of the conversation where there's a bit of nuance. You see, there are many different types of masks, each offering different levels of protection. For example, those blue fold-out surgical masks that you'll often see people walking around with, those are primarily designed to protect people other than the wearer. Of course, when a surgeon is performing an operation on somebody, there needs to be some way to keep any sort of saliva or mucus from dripping off the surgeon's face onto the patient. Now, as I've explained in previous videos, these masks do offer some protection to the wearer as well, but they are primarily designed to protect people other than the wearer. Now, N95 masks, on the other hand, are in fact designed to protect in both directions. This makes them ideal for use by medical professionals or people who work with sick people all day. Now, of course, different people need different levels of protection, so depending on what situation you're in, you may need a different type of mask. For example, if you're someone who's sick and just wants to protect others when you go out in public as a courtesy, then a plain surgical mask will probably do the trick. On the other hand, if you work in a hospital or a laboratory or some type of environment where you're around disease frequently, or if you're someone who's particularly vulnerable to illness, perhaps you're elderly or have a weak immune system, you'll probably want the mask that protects in both directions. Now, it is generally speaking true that the more people who wear masks, the more protected everyone is, and in an ideal world, everyone would just wear a mask and everyone would be protected. However, in reality, it is unrealistic to expect everyone to always wear a mask. So the most realistic strategy to take would be to have people who are specifically vulnerable to wear a mask that offers protection to the wearer.
But they make my nose sweaty.
If we all do our part, we can get rid of this virus.
You'll often hear people sell these masks as if there's some kind of silver bullet to ending the pandemic. Like, if everyone just wears a mask for X amount of time, we'll be done with this shit. You even had people going as far as saying that masks are more effective than a vaccine. Well, we've been wearing masks for just short of a year now, and the shit's still around. And as Tom Woods points out in his podcast, even places that have implemented mask mandates have experienced a second wave of cases. So even if you could make the argument that masks are helpful in delaying the spread of the virus, there's still hardly the silver bullet that people are making them out to be. And trust me, I wish that was the case. I wish masks were like the magic silver bullet to end the pandemic. Cause I'm getting pretty sick of this shit. If all we had to do was wear masks for a couple months and everything goes back to normal, trust me, I would love that. I would be wearing a mask all the time if that was the case.
And they fog up my sunglasses.
Just think of all the people who look up to you. Your fans.
You're right. I am such a role model. Daddy? I'm going to need a mask before we go out. Could you possibly locate some sort of...
I took the liberty of having some made, hand-dyed and embroidered. Only the finest for you, Muffin.
Ooh, Trey chic. How do I look?
Like a kind and thoughtful person who cares about other people.
Great! But seriously, how do I look?
Perfect.
So that concludes the mask portion of this video. Now, if you want to know more about what my opinion is on the whole mask issue, I actually have a whole playlist of videos I've made on masks. I'll go ahead and link it in the description. But if you want the gist of it, I am critical of government mask mandates, but I do encourage informed decision making on the issue. Like any other health related issue, I think the decision as to whether or not to wear a mask should be a decision that you yourself make, not the government. Now, of course, there are folks out there who do support mask wearing. They think it's a good idea to wear a mask, and if they want to encourage others to wear masks voluntarily, as Francine kind of does toward the end of the video there, then I support that. But I think that education as opposed to coercion is the best tool to get people to make good decisions. Well, now let's move on to the racism part of the video. Yeah, a show intended for 5 to 8 year olds needs to include a lecture on racism for some reason.
I gotta call Buster.
Hey, Arthur.
You may have noticed how unrealistically concerned these young characters are about these issues. Like, oh shit, something racist happened. I need to stop what I'm doing and immediately call my friend to talk about it. Like, I don't know about any of you guys, but when I was that age, I wasn't thinking about masks or racism or shit like that. I was thinking about toys, video games, going out back into the sandbox, shit like that. Come on, fellas, you'll have your whole life to worry about shit like racism, alright? When you're a kid, be a fucking kid. Go play your video games. Go ride a skateboard. Like, racism will be there when you're old enough to worry about it. Just enjoy being a kid.
Hey, Buster, did you see that video?
Yeah, I just watched it. It was awful. I can't believe someone would be hurt like that.
Again, why are children this age watching videos of supposedly racially motivated attacks against people? Like, again, when I was that age, I was watching, like, YouTube poops. Funny skateboard fails, celebrities in bikinis, like shit like that.
Just because they're black.
Racism is so unfair. No one should ever judge someone by the color of their skin.
Well, how do you know it's because they're black? Like, I agree, I don't think it's cool to judge people by the color of their skin, but how do you know the person in the video is being beaten because they're black? You see, the main problem here is that we as the audience are never given a comprehensive account of what actually takes place in the video. Now, of course, I understand why they don't actually show the video. This is, after all, a program intended for a young audience. It makes sense why actually depicting someone getting the tar beaten out of them on screen wouldn't exactly go down particularly well, but there are still other ways that you can portray a more thorough account of what happened to the audience. For example, you can have the characters sort of discuss what they saw without actually depicting it, maybe even quoting a bit of dialogue from the video in question, because your goal here is to try and get us to sympathize with the person in the video or with the issue of racism at large. But that's kind of difficult for us to do if we don't know any of the details of what actually happened. We don't know anything about the circumstances surrounding this beating, or much about the motivation behind it. All we know is that there is a black person who was beaten, and they were supposedly beaten because they're black.
But how could it happen here, in Elwood City, right outside the Sugar Bowl?
Actually, that's a pretty good question. In a world entirely inhabited by anthropomorphic animals, how is there video footage of a black person being beaten? I mean, it's kind of awkward to hear them talking about a black person being beaten in a world where there's no people, let alone black people. I don't know, maybe they're talking about a penguin or a skunk or some shit like that.
Buster, it happens everywhere.
So just like with the mask conversation, this is an instance where a little bit of nuance is in order. Yes, it is true that racism can happen anywhere and to anyone, but statistically speaking, there are places where it's more likely to happen. For example, the South tends to be more racist against blacks but more accepting of Hispanics, and as you move north, that kind of flips. Also, cities and urban areas tend to be more racist against whites while accepting of blacks, and rural areas the inverse. Now, the specific reasons for this are complicated and would most likely warrant its own video, but while racism can happen anywhere, there's places where it's more likely to happen.
I was talking to Mrs. McGrady the other day. She said there's a really long history of black people not being treated fairly in this country.
You are correct, sir.
Yes, this is correct. Black people have had it kind of rough throughout our country's history. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. However, I think there's a long history of a lot of different groups not being treated fairly in this country. And while yes, black people have had it kind of rough, I don't think that's anything unique to them specifically. I mean, look at how Hispanics are usually treated by border enforcement. Look at how Muslims were treated during the whole war on terror. Look at how Asians were treated demonstrated back during World War II when FDR implemented Japanese internment camps. Look at how Native Americans were utterly slaughtered and abused throughout this country's entire history. My ethnic background is largely Slavic, so Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, etc. And during the Cold War, we were all a bunch of dirty commies. So the point is, you can really look at any racial or ethnic group in this country and find some period in the history where they weren't exactly treated the best. This isn't unique to black people. As a matter of fact, what is unique to black people is the emphasis put on their suffering. If you look at all the major efforts to address racial injustice in this country, they've all focused on black people, whether it be the civil rights movement or affirmative action. All the other racial groups that suffered injustice just kind of had to suck it up, basically.
It has to stop.
Well, I mean, to a large extent it has. In just about every possible way, the quality of life of your average African American is on par with that of your average white. Now, that's not to say that there's no discrepancies whatsoever. Is there still some racism out there? Sure. Are there still some areas of life where black people have it a little harder than whites? Sure. I'm not necessarily trying to say that racism isn't a problem or that nothing should be done about it, but it definitely is a problem that's being blown out of proportion.
We have to do something!
Yeah! But what can we do? I mean, I'm 8. I can't even fry an egg on my own.
I know this is somewhat tangential, but really, dude, you can't even fry a fucking egg. Like, you get out a skillet, you turn on the stove, you melt some butter on the skillet, you crack an egg into the butter, you get a spatula and flip it over, boom, you're done. I mean, we're not even talking about making a full-on quiche or omelet or whatever, just one singular goddamn egg. Like, you could have picked a more trivial task. Like, are you missing a frontal lobe or something?
I don't know. Maybe Mrs. McGrady can give us some ideas. Hold on!
Hello, boys. I'm so glad you reached out to me. Yes, I saw the video too. And let me tell you, it made my blood boil.
Me too!
So did it make your blood boil because it's racist or because a person got beaten? Because they seem to really be focused on the racism here, but not so much the fact that a person got beaten. Because, you know, racism is supposedly the motivation behind this beating. I mean, we haven't really established that that's actually the case yet, but you're acting as if this would have been okay had the motivation been something else. Like, if I saw a video of someone getting a tar beaten out of them, that would in fact make my blood boil. Like, I wouldn't particularly care what the motivation was behind it. Like, it would still be wrong in my opinion.
It also made me scared. I mean, this happened in our neighborhood.
It is scary, Buster. But you should know that a lot of grown-ups are fighting racism and working hard to keep us all safe.
Well, for a lot of people, their idea of fighting racism is busting windows, flipping cars, lighting shit on fire, generally causing as much mayhem and destruction as possible. What I think is absolutely funny is when these people complain that their police department is racist, but then they'll go on to destroy everything in town except the police department. For example, in one town they burnt down the Wendy's, in another town they went and raided the Target, and in Baltimore, near where I live, they actually raided and destroyed a CVS. Yeah, destroying businesses in their own communities, that'll stick it to the white man.
Why does this keep happening, Mrs. McGrady?
Well, I mean, to a large extent, it's not. I mean, I'm sure it does happen. I'm sure there are instances out there of people being treated unfairly because of their race or ethnic background, but to a large extent, it's just not something you see much of anymore. As a matter of fact, according to data from several major law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, people are statistically more likely to be victims of crimes at the hands of someone of their own race as opposed to someone of another race. So what that basically means is that if you're white, you're statistically more likely to be attacked by a white person. If you're black, you're statistically more likely to be attacked by a black person. Now, the exact reasons for this are a bit complex and beyond the scope of this particular video, but just do keep in mind that racially motivated attacks are to a large extent just not something you see anymore.
Well, racism is like a disease. If you don't treat it, it's just going to get worse.
So the analogy between racism and disease is actually fairly accurate because you can draw a lot of parallels. Racism is a type of thing that can spread quickly and manifest in different ways. It grows stronger if not treated. And there's one aspect in which I think that the analogy between racism and disease is particularly strong. And that is that racism, like a disease, will often create symptoms that distract from the greater problem at hand. Oftentimes when someone is experiencing an illness, they'll focus on treating the symptoms as opposed to curing the disease that they have. The problem with that is that if you're only focusing on treating the symptoms and not curing the disease still lingers on. And I think we have a similar problem with racism. When people focus on solving racism, they focus on dealing with the symptoms of the issue, but not the issue itself. Here's what I mean by that. A good example of this is non-discrimination laws. Laws that basically force private business owners who are racist to serve people they don't want to against their will. Civil rights activists will often rejoice in victory that now racist business owners have to serve people they don't want to against their will. They will declare this victory, racism over, problem solved. This doesn't actually address the problem, however, because the business owner is still racist. The business owner is still holding those prejudicial views. Just because you're making it so that they can't manifest those views in a particular way doesn't mean the underlying issue still isn't there. This is why I don't consider the Civil Rights Act to be the major victory that a lot of other people consider it to be, because it puts a band-aid over the symptom of the problem without doing anything to cure the actual problem itself.
Wait, if racism is a disease, can I get it?
Well, strictly speaking, yes, you can. You see, racism is an idea or a concept. Specifically the idea or concept that certain groups of people are superior or inferior to another, and therefore deserve worse or better treatment. And just like any other idea or concept, it can spread between people. It can spread through in-person conversation, but these days it mostly spreads through social media and shit like that. And, well, rolling with the analogy of a disease, you can't actually get rid of a disease or make it go away. You can only build up an immunity to it. The same thing goes for racism or bad ideas in general. You can't make racist or prejudicial viewpoints go away. You can only build up an immunity to them by learning critical reasoning skills. If someone says Group A is inferior to Group B, or Group A deserves to be treated worse than Group B, or whatever the case may be, but doesn't substantiate it with any actual arguments or evidence, someone who's more attuned to critical reasoning will be able to resist the urge to buy into that idea. If racism is a disease, then critical reasoning is the vaccine.
Buster, don't worry. This isn't about you.
Actually, it is. It's about all of us. It's not enough to just say, I'm not racist.
Actually, I'm pretty sure it is. I'm pretty sure the remedy to racism is not being racist.
It's not my problem. We have to actively fight against racism. As my friend John Lewis once said,
You live in a fictional world. How are you friends with historical figures from the real world?
if you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it.
I will say there is some truth to this. There is a tendency among white people to assume that, well, since they're white, racism simply doesn't affect them, which a lot of them learn the hard way isn't actually the case when a bunch of BLM protesters beat the fuck out of them, or light their car on fire or some shit. But generally speaking, I agree with the idea that racism is a problem that affects all of us, even if you're not in the group on the receiving end of the discrimination. I think society as a whole is worse off when wedges are driven between groups of people.
So, what can we do?
Well, one of the most important things is what you're doing right now.
Eating carrot sticks?
You gotta love how Arthur is preaching to us about racism while at the same time engaging in stereotyping by having a rabbit character eat carrot sticks.
And isn't it ironic?
I mean, talking about it. Talk about racism with your friends, your parents, your teachers. Don't be afraid to ask questions. We all have a lot to learn about this issue.
Don't be afraid to listen to counter-arguments either. Don't get me wrong, I do think that racism and race-related issues are important things for people to be informed about and discuss. But if you are going to discuss racism with people, make sure you're having an actual discussion in which you're actually listening to the other person, not just spouting your narrative of what you believe to be the case. Because you may have seen a video of a black person getting beaten and you may think they're being beaten because they're black, but you might come to learn that they're being beaten for an entirely different reason and racism had absolutely nothing to do with it. I do agree that talking about racism and learning more about it can be a very useful thing to do, but make sure you're approaching it open-minded with intellectual honesty.
Also, listen. Listen to people who have experienced racism firsthand. Imagine what it would be like if it happened to you or someone you love.
I do think this is another bit of useful advice. A good way to understand a problem is to talk to someone who's actually experienced it themselves. A good friend of mine who's Asian has actually experienced a lot of racial discrimination before. And by talking to him about it, I was able to kind of learn a new perspective on the issue that maybe I wouldn't have seen before. So yes, this is a bit of advice that could potentially be helpful, but again, just make sure you're doing it with an open mind. Because you might talk to someone and they might say, well, they're experiencing this problem because they're black. Be open to the possibility that there might be other reasons contributing looking at that problem, and from their perspective, it's because they're black.
And finally, act. When you see or hear of someone being treated unfairly, stand up for them. Say something. It might be scary, but I guarantee you it's better for everyone, and it's the right thing to do.
Okay, this is another bit of advice I can get behind. If you see a situation that's not necessarily fair, you can always say something about it, whether or not it involves racism. As a matter of fact, that's kind of what I do in my videos. I discuss instances or situations where I think people aren't being treated fairly, and I speak out about it. And this can be a useful way of getting things accomplished. But again, like the other issues, try and approach it in a way that's open-minded. Try and understand the situation in its entirety before you get involved. Because a lot of times when people just go white knighting into a situation without fully understanding it, it can oftentimes actually make things worse.
Wow! You've really inspired me!
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. McGrady.
I'm going to talk with my parents about this right now! Hey, Mom!
Me too. Bye!
Whoa, that's it. I was just getting going. Remember, kids, talk, listen, and act. If we work together, we can make a difference. And eat those carrots, too.
So yeah, they edit like bear ears on the John Lewis there. I don't know, maybe bears are like the black people of this universe? Kind of like how snails are the cats of SpongeBob, I don't know. So what are my final thoughts on this clip about racism? Well, speaking of racism in general, I feel it's one of those problems that exists, but it's kind of blown out of proportion by the media. Like, yeah, I'm sure there are instances of black people or certain minorities not being treated fairly, and it is unfortunate that that happens, but it's not nearly as big of a problem as people think it is. But I will give them credit for suggesting ways of dealing with it that are actually somewhat productive, like, having a conversation about it, speaking up about it, as opposed to, just blaming the police on everything and burning shit down. And I'm not necessarily upset that Arthur's tackling issues like racism, because like I've said before, Arthur has addressed political issues in the past and has actually done it pretty well. My issue is more with the approach that they take. They're directly talking about racism and black people, which is kind of awkward in a world where there's no people, let alone black people. You see, when Arthur would address political issues in the past, they'd usually use metaphors. Something else would stand in for the issue being discussed. You see, when you have a show like Arthur that takes place in a fictional world, in order to address problems happening in a real world, you kind of have to use metaphors, or things that stand in place of it. For example, one of my favorite episodes of Arthur, and it's a prime example of how well they can take on political issues, is called April 9th. The episode revolves around a massive fire that takes place at the school, and all the characters are kind of coping with it. It's a metaphor intended to address the terrorist attacks that occurred at the World Trade Center on September 11th. The advantages of using metaphors like this is not only does it make sense within the fictional world, but it also sort of portrays the issues in ways that kids are more likely to understand. Now, of course, do I think Arthur could tackle an issue like racism and do it well? Of course. After all, the movie Zootopia leveraged a world of anthropomorphic animals to teach kids about racism and discrimination, and it does it rather well. So yeah, my issue isn't necessarily with the message, more the presentation, if that makes sense. But anyways, thanks for watching, and take care.